For 12 years, I believed that what you said in a meeting was on the record. You spoke, someone typed it into the minutes, and that was that. A fact preserved. Then a release we shipped failed in front of our biggest client, and leadership stood up and said the risk had never been raised. That no one saw it coming. I saw it coming. I said so out loud in the go/no-go review before we ever shipped. I asked us to hold the launch. I watched a colleague nod. So I opened the minutes from that meeting, expecting to find my own words. They weren't there. The paragraph where I raised the concern was simply gone, as if I'd never spoken at all. For a moment, I thought I'd misremembered. Then I noticed the small print at the bottom of the document, the line that says when a file was last edited. It had been changed 2 days after the failure. 2 days after, when the meeting itself was weeks behind us. Who edits the minutes of a meeting that already happened? For most of those 12 years, my job had a simple shape. I read things closely, and I said what I found. I was a senior operations manager, which mostly meant I was the person in the room who had actually opened the file. I read the defect reports. I read the test results. I read the appendix nobody else read. When a number didn't match the story being told about it, I was the one who raised my hand. It didn't make me popular, but it made me useful, and for a long time those felt like the same thing. People trusted me to tell them the unglamorous truth before it became an expensive one. My managers used to say I was the conscience of the release calendar. I took that as a compliment. I believed the record was on my side, because the record was just a list of true things that had happened, and I had spent a career making sure the true things got written down. I had a habit that went with it. After any meeting that mattered, I'd write a short recap to myself. 3 or 4 lines, what was decided, what I'd flagged, what was still open, and email it to my own inbox before I left the building. It wasn't suspicion. It was bookkeeping. I liked knowing that if a decision went sideways, I could walk back to the moment it was made and read exactly what we'd said. Our company built software systems for large institutional clients, the kind where one bad release didn't just annoy people, it stopped their business for a day. So we had a ritual called the go/no-go review, a readiness meeting before every major launch, where the lead sat in one room and decided whether the thing was safe to ship. I had sat through dozens of them. I had never seen one go truly wrong. The release in question was the biggest we'd done that year for the biggest client we had. In 3 days before it shipped, I opened the final defect report and felt my stomach drop. The numbers weren't ready. The go/no-go was on a Thursday. I came in early and read everything twice because I knew what I was about to say, and I wanted to be sure I was right before I said it. The room was full. Marsh, our director, ran it. Polished, confident, the kind of man who could make a hard quarter sound like strategy. Priya, my manager, sat to my left. The leads filled the rest of the table. When my turn came, I said it plainly. There was a class of defects still open in the core module, the kind that didn't show up until the system was under real client load. I walked them through the report. I said I didn't think we were ready, and I recommended we hold the launch by 2 weeks to clear them. I wasn't dramatic about it. I just laid the data on the table and said what it meant. Marsh heard me out. Then he said the date was committed. The client had been promised this window, leadership had signed off, and a slip would cost us more than a defect would. He said the open items were acceptable risk. He thanked me for the diligence, and he moved the meeting on. I didn't win. That happens. But I'd said it in front of 9 people, and I'd watched one of the other leads nod when I laid out the numbers. Before I left, I emailed myself the recap, the way I always did. Then I went home and told myself I'd done my job. We shipped on schedule. For about 3 weeks, nothing happened, and I started to think maybe Marsh had been right, and I'd been cautious. Then on a Tuesday morning, the core module failed under load, exactly the way I described it, and it failed in production, in front of the client we could least afford to fail in front of. Their operations stopped for most of a day. The phone calls went all the way up. The company moved fast, which is what companies do when a client is angry. There was an incident review. There were apologies. And there was a story assembled quickly and repeated everywhere about what had gone wrong. The story was this: the failure had been unforeseeable. The risk had not been identified before launch. Nobody had raised it. We had all simply missed it, and now we would learn from it. I heard that sentence. The risk had not been identified before launch. In a leadership update, said calmly, as settled fact. And I sat very still because I had identified it. I had stood in a room and named the exact defect class that took the client down. I had asked us to wait. For a day, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. Someone would correct it. Surely Marsh or Priya or any of the 9 people in that room would say, actually, this was flagged. We made a call. The call was wrong. That's an uncomfortable thing to admit, but it's the kind of thing grown professionals admit. Nobody said it. The story hardened, and the longer it held, the more I started to doubt my own memory. Had I said it as clearly as I remembered? Had I really recommended a hold? Or had I just noted a concern in a way that was easy to slide past? There was one place that would know for certain: the minutes. Every go/no-go was documented. A coordinator took notes in a shared file, and those minutes were the official account of what was decided and why. If I had raised the risk, it would be in there. If I hadn't, I needed to stop telling myself I had. So I opened the file. I read it slowly, the way I read everything. The minutes recorded the meeting in careful detail. The attendees, the decision to proceed, the committed date. They even noted small remarks, a question someone asked about documentation, a scheduling note about the next review. My warning wasn't there. Not softened, not summarized into something vague. Gone. The section where I'd laid out the defect report and recommended a hold simply did not exist. The minutes flowed from the agenda item straight to the decision to ship, smoothly, with no seam, as if the recommendation had never been made, as if I had sat in that room for an hour and said nothing at all. My first thought was the ordinary one. The coordinator missed it. People miss things. But I'd watched these minutes get taken for years, and they didn't miss decisions. They missed adjectives. A formal recommendation to hold a major launch was not the kind of thing that fell through the cracks. And even if it had, the gap would have been ragged. This wasn't ragged. It was clean. The two halves of the meeting had been stitched together so neatly that you'd never know a piece was missing unless you'd been in the room. I was still telling myself it could be innocent when I scrolled to the bottom of the document, out of habit, and read the line I'd read on 1,000 files without ever really thinking about it. Last modified. The meeting had been 6 weeks ago. The minutes should have been finalized within a day or two of it, the way they always were. But the date on that line wasn't 6 weeks old. It was from 2 days after the failure. Someone had opened a 6-week-old meeting record and changed it 2 days after the thing it described had blown up in public. I read the date 3 times. There is no innocent reason to edit the minutes of a meeting that already happened in the narrow window right after that meeting's decision turns out to be a disaster. I sat there for a while, not angry yet, just cold and very awake. Because if the record had been edited, the question wasn't whether my memory was wrong. The question was who had reached into the file and what else they had touched. Most document systems keep a version history, a quiet log of every save, who made it and when, with the ability to see what the file looked like before. I'd used it 100 times for boring reasons, to recover a paragraph or settle who changed a deadline. I had never opened it with my heart beating the way it was now. I pulled up the history for the minutes. There was laid out like a timeline I hadn't asked for. The file had been created and finalized in the days after the meeting, normal and unremarkable. Then, weeks later, 2 days after the failure, there was a single new revision. One edit, made long after the document should have been closed. I opened the earlier version, the one from right after the meeting, and read it. My warning was in it. The whole paragraph, the defect class, the report, the recommendation to hold the launch by 2 weeks, the decision to proceed anyway. It had been there all along, exactly as I remembered saying it. The later revision was the one that had removed it. And the version history did one more thing, the thing that turned a cold morning into something I couldn't put down. It listed who had made that edit. Marsh, the director who had overruled me, the man whose committed date we'd shipped on. He had opened the record of the meeting where I warned him 2 days after that warning came true in front of our biggest client, and he had deleted the part where I warned him. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt, because it wasn't triumph and it wasn't even yet fury. It was the specific vertigo of watching something you trusted turn out to be editable. The minutes were supposed to be the floor you stood on, and someone had quietly moved the floor. I also knew, immediately, that a version history alone could be argued with. People are clever about these things. He could say the edit was a formatting fix, a cleanup, that the missing paragraph was an accident of the merge. I'd seen reasonable-sounding explanations dissolve real evidence before. If I was going to stand on this, I needed proof from somewhere Marsh couldn't reach, a source outside the document he had altered. Then I remembered the email, the recap I'd sent myself the night of the go/no-go. It was sitting in my own inbox, on my own account, 6 weeks old, time-stamped, completely outside the meeting file. I opened it with a kind of dread, hoping I'd actually written what I thought I had. I had 3 lines, plain as ever, flagged open defect class and core module, recommended 2-week hold to clear, decision was proceed on committed date. Dated the evening of the meeting. Untouched, because no one but me had ever known it existed. So now I had 2 things that agreed with each other and disagreed with the official record. The version that existed before Marsh's edit and my own contemporaneous email written the same night. 2 independent sources saying the same true thing the minutes had been changed to hide. There was one more piece I could check. Our systems kept access logs, a record of which accounts opened and saved which files, separate from the document's own history. I didn't have deep access, but I knew someone in IT who did, and I asked carefully for the access record on that one file around the date of the edit. It came back the way I already expected. The document had been opened and saved under Marsh's account on the morning 2 days after the failure. The story didn't have a gap anymore. It had a fingerprint. I should have felt vindicated. Mostly I felt sick because a single deleted warning under pressure could almost be understood. A frightened man making a frightened choice in a bad week. Well, I couldn't stop thinking was a colder question. If he knew how to do this and knew it would work, was this really the first time? That's when I thought of Dana. A couple of years earlier, on a different project, there had been a smaller failure, and a colleague named Dana had taken the blame for it. The narrative then had rhymed with this one. A risk that should have been caught, a quiet conclusion that she'd missed it, and not long after, Dana moved off the team and eventually out of the company. At the time, I'd accepted it the way you accept things that don't happen to you. She'd seemed competent. I'd been a little surprised. Then I moved on. Now I went looking. The minutes for that old project were still archived where they always were. I opened the readiness review from back then and read it the way I now knew to read these things, not for what it said, but for what was missing and when it had last been touched. Her risk flag wasn't in it, and the version history showed a late edit, made well after the meeting, under the same account that had touched mine. I sat back. 2 projects. 2 careful people who'd raised the exact concern that later came true. 2 warnings removed from the record after the fact. The same hand on both files. This was not a man panicking once. This was something he knew how to do. I reached out to Dana carefully. I didn't lead her. I just asked what she remembered about that release, whether she'd had concerns going in. And without my prompting, she described the same arc I'd just lived. She'd raised the risk in the readiness review. She'd been overruled on a date. It had failed close to the way she'd predicted. And then, somehow, the story became that no one had warned anyone, and the warning had been hers to carry. I spent a year thinking I'd failed, she told me. I went over and over what I should have said. It never once occurred to me to look at who'd touched the file. It hadn't occurred to me either until a date at the bottom of a page didn't match the truth I remembered. We're trained to doubt our memory before we doubt the record. That's exactly why the record was worth changing. I stopped thinking about Marsh as a man who'd done a bad thing and started thinking about what the bad thing was for. Because the why mattered and the why was not cartoonish. It was ordinary, which made it worse. Marsh had committed that launch date personally. He'd promised it upward to leadership and through them to the board. His reputation as the director who delivered was built on dates like this one. There was a bonus tied to on-time delivery, but honestly the money was the smaller part. The bigger part was the story he told about himself, the one where he made the hard calls and they paid off. A documented warning didn't fit that story. As long as the failure was unforeseeable, it was bad luck, and bad luck doesn't end careers. But a warning, raised in writing in a meeting by the person whose job was to raise it, that turned bad luck into a decision. His decision. The minutes weren't a problem to him because they were inaccurate. They were a problem because they were accurate. So he didn't fix the mistake. He deleted the evidence that it had been a choice. Erasing me from the record was cheaper than owning the call, and quieter, and until someone scrolled to the bottom of a page, completely invisible. That's the part one keep coming back to. He wasn't a villain in a story. He was a man protecting a version of himself. And the only thing standing in the way of that version was the truth, so he edited the truth. And the worst of it, the part that turned my stomach all over again, was that I had been right. The risk was real, which meant somewhere, after the failure, someone had quietly done the thing I'd asked for. I went looking for that too, and I found it. Weeks after the incident, there was a change order in the system, a fix applied to the core module that was almost word for word the 2-week holding clear I'd recommended in the meeting that no longer admitted I'd spoken. The safeguard I'd asked for had been implemented after the damage instead of before it. In the change order, it was filed under lessons learned. My name wasn't anywhere near it. That's a strange kind of vindication. To find proof you were right tucked inside the cleanup of being ignored. The fix existed. The lesson had been learned. I'd been the one who taught it, and I'd been erased from the record of having taught it. And the change order, when I followed its approvals, routed back through the same director who had reached into the minutes. There was one person I hadn't accounted for, and I'd been avoiding her because I didn't want the answer. Priya, my own manager. She'd been in the go/no-go. She'd heard me say it, the same as everyone. And in the incident review, she had repeated the line that the risk hadn't been raised without correcting it. I went to her. I didn't ambush her. I just told her what I'd found plainly and watched her face do the thing I'd been dreading. She didn't deny it. She did something worse. She managed it. That's how it was written up, she said, not meeting my eyes. When I pointed out who had written it up, and when she looked tired more than surprised. It came from above me, she said. I didn't want to relitigate the whole thing. The client was already gone. What was reopening it going to fix? I understood her, which was its own kind of injury. She wasn't malicious. She was a decent person who had decided, in a hard moment, that the cost of telling the truth was higher than the cost of letting a quiet lie stand. The distant director deleting a file was easier to hate. The manager who'd heard me, who knew me, who'd chosen silence because silence was cheaper, that was the cut that went deeper. Marsh moved the floor. Priya watched him do it and smoothed the carpet back over the seam. I had everything now. The earlier version of the minutes with my warning intact. My own time-stamped email from the night of the meeting. The access log with Marsh's account on the edit. The same pattern on Dana's old file. The change order that proved the risk was real. And a manager who, asked directly, wouldn't deny any of it. So I had a decision, and it was a real one, not a movie one. I could let it go. Marsh was senior. This would land hard. There would be a cost to being the person who brought it. Or I could take it to compliance and let the evidence do what evidence does. For a few days, I genuinely considered letting it go. Then I thought about Dana spending a year deciding she'd failed, and I thought about the next person who'd raise a hand in a readiness review and trust that what they said would stay said. Altering an official record after an incident isn't a personality flaw. It's a governance failure, and if it worked twice, it would work again. I built the packet the way I'd build any report. Calm, sourced, no adjectives. The two versions of the minutes side by side. The version history with the edit and the name. The access log. My email. Dana's file. The change order. A timeline anyone could follow without me in the room. Then I brought it to compliance. They were quiet while they read it, which is how you know something has landed. Then they started asking the right questions, not about my feelings about the logs. They pulled the records themselves. They confirmed the edit against the access history and against my email, three independent things telling one story. The findings came back over the following weeks. The tampering was substantiated. The official record had been altered after the incident, and the alteration was traced to Marsh's account. He was removed from the leadership role and placed under review. The minutes were restored, my warning put back where I'd set it in the version that would now be the official one. Dana's old record was corrected too, her name finally lifted off a failure she'd tried to prevent. And a policy changed, which mattered more to me than any single consequence. Readiness minutes and incident records were locked and version audited going forward, and post-incident reviews were now required to pull immutable copies of the original records, not the editable files. The thing that had been done to me would be much harder to do to the next person. The system, not just one man, had been corrected. Compliance offered me an apology, a real one, and some words about my integrity. I was grateful for it, but I noticed it didn't give me the weeks back, the weeks of doubting my own memory, of wondering if I'd imagined the only honest thing I'd done in that room. It didn't quite give back the easy trust one used to have in a finalized file. Being believed is not the same as never having been erased. People ask me if I feel vindicated, and the honest answer is that vindication turned out to be a smaller thing than I expected. My warning is back in the record. The tampering is noted. Marsh was reassigned, his story about himself finally corrected by the one record he couldn't keep clean. Dana's name is clear. We talk sometimes, two people who stopped blaming themselves on the same week. Priya told me, quietly, that she should have spoken up in that review, and I believe she meant it. I didn't need her to grovel. I needed her to know that I knew. Being right was never going to feel like winning. It just felt true, which is a quieter thing and steadier. I learned that a record can be edited, but the version history keeps its own memory. Every save, every name, every date someone hoped you'd never check. And so do I. I still send myself the recap after every meeting that matters, 3 or 4 plain lines into my own inbox before I leave the building. Not because I'm waiting for the next Marsh, because I've learned that the truth keeps better when more than one person is holding it. The floor can be moved, but you can write down where it used to be. I sleep fine now,